Okay, so the rest of this lumdus is really about whether or not you have to lift the object a significant amount or not, and he says, I'm just skipping to the bottom line. He says, "Umikol makom ladina nir le'aniyas daiti, sheyesh laharimo gimel tfachim kidei latzeit yedei hakol." You should try your best whenever you do a kinyan, which involves hagbaha, like selling your chametz, that you should try to lift up the item 3 tfachim whenever possible. U'chemoshe pasak hamishna brura kedivrei hataz, af le'inyan erev dekil u'chemoshe nizkar l'mayla. That even when it comes to relatively minor halachic transactions, the Mishnah Berurah advocates for this. And therefore, okay. He says, "Va'ayin od b'nesivas b'simin kuf tzadiches shabir dechol hanach shiurim sheneru b'kinyan hagba b'ari b'chgon shabolet hachefetz min yadu litzdadin." He says, when do we say that you need to lift up 3 tfachim? Is when the object that you're using for the exchange protrudes outside the volume of your hands. Sha'az eino kone mitam avir yado, rak mitam hagba. In which case, in order to make an acquisition, you're acquiring it based on the air that you're lifting it through, and not because of the hand itself that is acquiring it. There is something that's called a kinyan through the fact, by virtue of the fact that it is resting soundly in your hand. Aval b'mikra shekol hachefetz ba'avir yado kone below hagba mitam kinyan yad. He says, but let's say the object of acquisition is small enough that it fits soundly in the palm of your hand. So let's say you want to be kone a dice. You know, the item that's being used for the transaction is a die. Okay, so then in that situation, you wouldn't have to lift it 3 tfachim, because there's something called kinyan yad, where just by virtue of being in your hand, you acquire it. He says, then you don't have to lift your hand at all. He says, but obviously, if the best practices is to always lift up the object 3 tfachim, and that way you don't have to deliberate. Is it completely in the airspace of my hand? Is it not? And you are covered. Yes, faxing. Right. So, we pointed out, I don't remember that sheer, Lloyd, you remember it better than I do. But we say on the top of every chametz form that making a kinyan is lechatchila, the preferred method to go. But even signing of the shtar is a valid method of authorization when you can't make a kinyan. So it's like best practice. What's the lechatchila? See the rabbi, make a kinyan, and take the rabbi's pen, lift it up, his keys, whatever he gives you, lift it up, 3 tfachim, give him the shtar, and you're all set. If you can't do it because you're out of town or it's not convenient, so you can sign the shtar, scan it, email it over. No one faxes anymore. Okay, Perek Daled. Almost no one faxes anymore.
End up with junk mail. Like fax, we used to fax, but now fax and go it would give you but this could end up in somebody's junk mail, and then the rabbi's junk mail or whatever.
Yeah, it could, or the guy accidentally leaves out a period, in the email, right? And it goes to someone else. there's a guy who has my private email. He has, he's a rabbi in Australia, and he has just one added letter. So I regularly get emails from Australia addressed to this guy. And it's quite interesting because sometimes they're nasty emails. But in any event, so.
In the context of this policy,
Well, he's basically saying that you should try your best to make a binding kinyan with the executor or the executor's shaliach. So the only, in many instances, you don't even have to notify the person that you're giving a gift to. But he said that in this case, he feels that you should notify the guy that you're using a shaliach of his. And the reason is because it may not be considered a benefit, since he'll never, in all likelihood, never see a penny from the deal. Okay, let's look at Perek Dalet. Dinim hanogiim liktivat hatzava'ah, some other halachos that pertain to the writing of the will. Okay, v'mikre shehatzava mechila yoser midaf echad. He says one pertinent halacha is that whenever the will is longer than one page, yachtom kosev hatzava es shemo v'roshe tevos v'shulei kol daf v'daf samuch l'shura ha'achrona. He says the testator should sign his name at the beginning of the line, at the margin of the page at the bottom. In other words, I guess the right side, if you're at the right side of the page, if the will is in English, on the left side of the page if the will is in Hebrew. V'gam yichtavu et misparo shel kol daf v'daf l'mayla b'rosh hagilyon samuch l'shura harishona shel hadaf. You should also write the page number at the very top of the blank of the margin. In other words, at the top margin, near the first line. Shelo yehi sham revach lichtov ot shura lo l'mayla v'lo l'mata. The reason for doing that is you want to prevent the ability to fill in an extra and added line, unbeknownst to anyone else, that someone puts in a little bit more information than you had intended. And if you recall, when our shtaros were handwritten, this was especially pertinent. But I suppose that it has legal concern today also, when people can forge even typeset documents. Have you ever dealt with forgery issues? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the footnote, he says, "Demikivin shetzava ato hi kitanai bishtar hahit chayvut shalo." He says because the will is really part of the condition of your promissory note that you've made to that executor, right? And therefore, ba'inan shelo yehi bo chashash ziyuv, we have to make sure that there's no suspicion of forge or counterfeiting. V'lo chatimato minolan di'ihu tziva be'emes kain. He says, and without his signature, how do we know that this was really his will? Maybe another person snuck these pages into the will. He says, even if the papers are paginated, who's to say, if his signature is not on each page, who's to say that this was one of the original paginated pages? Maybe a counterfeiter, took out page 5 from the will and inserted a new page 5. So The Shemiros Hashonos Shesamchim Aleim Ha'orchei Din Va'Arkos L'No Efsharos Aziyuf Ein Nira Sheyitchashvu Kishmirot Maspikot Lefi Dineinu. And what Rav Cohen says, surprisingly, in the brackets, he says the protective measures that they take in secular law in order to make sure that it's not a counterfeit, it seems to me, he says, are insufficient when held up to the scrutiny of Jewish law. In other words, in Jewish law, we're even more careful to make sure that there's no possibility of forgery. Now, I don't know where he gets this from, but okay. But basically what he's saying is that once it's important, I guess what he's probably trying to imply is that once you do this, this promissory note as an adjunct to your will, you've now created a scenario where your will is a halachic document and not just a secular document. And therefore you have to try and make sure that it conforms to halachic criteria to the best of your ability. And well, apparently you don't, because signing it is considered sufficient, probably based on Dina de Malchusa Dina. And by the way, as I mentioned to you, I think we learned this in Imrei Yaakov, even though you say it was enacted, your promissory note was enacted in a Beis Din Chashuv, you don't need to actually take it to a Beis Din Chashuv. You need, I'm not sure that you need witnesses. I think as long as you sign it yourself, that would be sufficient, unless you're concerned that someone's going to think that your signature was a forgery. The next thing that he says in the footnote is, he says, when we're talking about signing your name at the very bottom of the paper, at the beginning of the line, he says, the lifa'amim bahosafas shura echas ishtane tochen hatzava. He says, sometimes just adding one line of text could completely alter the nature of the will. The yovu mizeh hefsed liyorshim olabilti yorshim sheyesh lahem zchus b'tzava. He says, and that could result in a complete deprivation to the rightful heirs. Va'ayin ke'ein zeh b'chidushe haritva va'omer Rabbeinu Tamzal demikol makom roi limno lechatchila melachtom afilu harishon levado be'emsa haklaf. He says, he quotes the Ritva, and we saw this in the Imrei Yaakov at the very end when we were talking about the laws of writing up contracts, that you have to try and discourage the witnesses from signing their name in the middle of the line. He says, Dilma gayas leili Eloi, v'yichtov ba'oso hachelek hachov al ha'ed, v'chulei. Because one of the things that could possibly be done is, what if someone were to get a hold of this promissory note and he sees the witness's signature on the bottom in the middle of the page, and there's blank space on both sides of the witness's signature. A guy could take that piece of paper, completely cut the body of the text. He has a little bit of margin space on top or on the sides, and he could write, let's say the name of the witness is Yankel Schwartz, and he signs his name Yankel Schwartz, and then he says, I, Yankel Schwartz, hereby owe $1 million to Plony ben Plony, right? So he says you could end up turning the witness into a debtor by doing this. He says, V'yichtov ba'oso achel chov al ha'ed, v'chein kosav haRamban, v'chidusho sham v'doma lezek kosav gam b'taz, b'choshen Mishpat, b'motzi alechet chasimas yado levad, shepasak sham hataz de'ein govin bo kevin shehuva kach lifnei beis din b'psul, dehayachol la'asos ziyuf v'lichtov alav kafi ma sheyirtza. Similarly, the Ramban writes that if a piece of paper just has someone's signature on it without edim, that's not actionable in a beis din, because who knows, it could have been a forgery, or they could have filled in information around the signature. He says, and even if the debtor says it's true, the shtar is good, nonetheless, the beis din should suspect, because maybe there's some collusion between the creditor and the debtor, ve'ein lo l'shalom mafsido al yedei zeh, and et cetera, et cetera. So you just have to be as cautious as possible. Okay, let's take a look at the next. Kol seif shevitzava she'ein shuraso hachrona mistayemet b'sof hashita ela b'emso b'nisho shamakom chalak at sof hashita. He says if you're writing a will and you end up with ending a paragraph in the middle of the line, and so you have some blank space there. She'efshel lichtov sham davar hamishaneh tochen hatzava'ah. In such a way that in theory it could be possible to fill in the rest of the line and change the terms of the will. Yesh letayet et yeter hashita, dahainu sheimshoch sham shurat diosh lo yuchal lichtov sham od. Draw a line or some dots and fill it in the line to prevent the opportunity for additional text to be filled in there. We don't do that. We don't do that in secular law, not at all. And finally, if you're writing a second will, people do this many times throughout their lifetime, where they'll draft an initial will, 10 years later they'll revisit it, draw up another will, and change the amounts and change the distribution or add different beneficiaries. This happens all the time with regularity. So you don't have to write up a new promissory note. As long as you're happy with the original promissory note, it basically gets appended to your latest will automatically. Okay.
Business point of view, I have to, so yeah, you have your will for your household, I guess. But your business will also have to go. So there are things to think about when you're doing a business book, your owner has a business, about who the beneficiaries are there, because it can't be left with emails. So how would that work with the same principles as your first book?
It's the same. I don't see any, unless you can demonstrate that there's a substantive difference, just like you can leave your personal assets to a female, as long as you do this promissory note issue, you should be able to do the same thing with your business as well, your business assets. I don't see any difference unless you can tell me why something would be different. I don't see why not. But you're still the testator. In other words, you're the owner of the business, right? So explain to me, because I'm not knowledgeable on this. Why do you need a separate will for the business than from your personal assets? Uh-oh. Better get in touch with that lawyer.
Lawyer just trying to add other things, I don't know. Hold on, Stay tuned.
Okay. It was worth it to attend the shir today, just for that.
Yeah. The laws there, otherwise I can get it, whatever, but usually it's after one hospital.
Okay. I want a commission on that. All right. Okay. Perek Hey. This following chapter provides us instructions for an executor on an estate and for the people who are heirs or sort of the beneficiaries of a person's will. Okay, and the truth is the word beneficiary is more correct than heir, because the word heir or yoresh really refers to a rightful heir as defined by the Torah. And really the word beneficiary, or a zoche in Hebrew, refers to people who have been named in the will, and they may or may not be a rightful heir. They still are beneficiaries of the will. So we'll use that term beneficiaries. Okay. So, well, standard Hebrew always defaults to the masculine. That's just, that I don't think there's anything sexist about that. That's just standard Hebrew. Whenever you're talking about mixed genders, you always use the masculine. Okay. V'yesh omnam ladat sha'af b'chtivat shtar ha'yitchayvut shenitba'er in beperak aleph ubeis lo nifteru adayin kol haba'ayot shebe'inyan zeh. He says, even when you write the promissory notes that we've delineated, the first promissory note, which is the more straightforward one, and the second promissory note when you want to protect your wife's independent assets and make sure that her wishes are upheld. He says there are still certain issues that have not been completely resolved. Ki yeshnam shlosha mikrim asher bahem oto shtar hitchayvut eina monea tachshash shel gezel ve'eluhem. There are three circumstances that still remain where there could still, even with these promissory notes, there will still be a problem of stealing if I am named as a beneficiary and I don't address the following three issues. Number one, ha'echad hu b'mikreh shenimtza bi'izavon davar shel shava kesef kegon bayit uchedome. He says, let's say the estate has something that is cash equivalent, such as real estate, a house, etc. V'haben v'habas hayorshim b'shavek v'tanai hatzava b'chulakim heim b'davar chalukat oto shavek kesef. And there's a dispute between the beneficiaries as to how to split up the house. Shekol echad rotzeh bo u'muchan l'shalim zuzi ba'ado l'sheknegdo. What happens if a son and a daughter are named as the beneficiaries of the house? And the son wants to buy out the daughter, and the daughter wants to buy out the son. So what do you do in a situation like that? Asher lefi tanai hatzava ein zuchut haben bazeh godol mizchut habat. And according to the terms of the will, neither child has greater sort of leverage over the other into who's going to buy out who. Aval lekushta de milta, kevin shekol kocha shelabat bizavonu biglal hachov shekibel hamitzavel atzmo, bikoch shtar hitchayvut hanal. He says, but on the other hand, the son is the true heir, and the daughter is merely a named beneficiary. So this is where I'm going to leave you in suspense and see that there is a possibility that there might exist an advantage over the son over the daughter, even though they're equally named in the will. We'll talk about this in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Have a great